Welcome back to another episode of the Bob Fu Report. I'm your co-host, Jonathan Dingler, bringing you updates and stories of human rights, religious freedom, and rule of law in China. WeChat is a versatile messaging and social media app in China, but it's always been in the firm grasp of the Chinese Communist Party. The popular app now censors the word Christ, as found by China Aid sources. Since the Chinese Communist Party's measures for the administration of Internet religious information services came into effect on March 1st, Christian WeChat accounts and groups became the main area of suppression. Early Rain Covenant Church's Ron Yanfui has a WeChat group called How to Read. Group members recommend book titles and vote on them every month with WeChat's built-in voting capabilities. During the most recent round of voting, group members recommended some of the following books: The Defense of the Faith by Cornelius Van Til, Tradition and the Individual Talent by T.S. Eliot, The Imitation of Christ by Thomas A. Kempis, and Exposition of the Christian Faith by St. Ambrose. However, the voting was unable to pass WeChat's censorship, showing the following message to the group administrator. The word Christ you are trying to publish violates regulations on Internet information services, including but not limited to the following categories: pornography, gambling, drug abuse, excessive marketing, and incitement. The issue can be resolved through one of the following: edit your content or submit for review. Unfortunately, the group administrator had to replace part of the word Christ to pass the WeChat censorship. This WeChat reading group was established 5 years ago. Group members will read through one book a month. And at the end of each month, Early Rain Church's Ron Yanfui sends out audio messages to help the members better understand their reading. On February 11th, before the new measures even took effect, he and many Christians were temporarily banned from using WeChat. According to regulations set forth from the administrative measures, no organization or individual may conduct any information for religion services on the internet, unless permission is obtained from a provincial government department. It is also explicitly listed that the permissive conditions, required documents, application processing time, and so on are the responsibility of provincial governments. Only religious groups, schools, and organizations with valid permits can conduct online sermons. Unless the conditions specified by Article 15 and Article 16 are met, no organization or individual may teach on the internet, conduct religious education and training, publish sermons, repost or link related content, organize religious activities on the internet, or live broadcast or record and broadcast religious ceremonies. No organization or individual may raise funds on the internet in the name of religion either. But these Christians are still meeting in this group. But in a good bit of news, the 5 Christians from Zion Reformed Church that were arrested for illegally crossing the national border, they've all been released. The last 2 found their friends and family waiting for them outside the detention center. Wang Runyan held his son in one hand and his daughter in the other. He posted on social media afterwards, "Dear family, we are back home safely. Thank you for your prayers. I'm very grateful." As our viewers know, these 5 Christians from Zion Reformed were arrested at the same time last year in 2021. They attended a gospel and culture conference the year prior held by Pastor Tong in Malaysia. They used legal visas and passports, but were arrested anyway for illegally crossing the national border. Song Sushan was sentenced to 6 months. Zhang Yaowen and Wang Shikang were released after 7 months, and the other 2 Christians were released after their 8-month stint. In other news, Chen Wensheng was released after serving 15 days in detention, 7 days in a detention center and 8 in a rehab center. Neither Chen nor his family received any legal notice for this brief sentence. Chen Wensheng is a Christian attending a small house church in Hunan province. He was a drug user for over 10 years before he converted to Christianity. He initially heard the gospel at a rehab center and became a Christian, eventually becoming sober because of the gospel. He has been passionate about preaching the gospel since his conversion. He often holds a cross that has a writing that says, "Glorify the Savior," and "Repent, trust, and be redeemed." He and other Christians from his church emulate what the apostles did, visiting each town and village, proclaiming the gospel in Henyang and other regions. The farthest place they've traveled is Tibet. However, in this most recent instance, Chen Wensheng traveled 1,000 miles to Yunnan province to proclaim the gospel to ethnic minorities. Several government organizations were tracking him, however, and they followed him to Yunnan and kept him in custody during the National Two Sessions. These National Two Sessions refer to a time when the legislative body of the Chinese government meets. It's common practice for authorities to lock up dissidents, pastors, or evangelists during these sessions. Being a previous drug user, however, it is speculated that the reason they held him in a rehab center was to defame him. Chen used this as an opportunity, though, to share the gospel with his oppressors. After his release, he returned to evangelize in the streets, per usual for Chen. You can find out more information about Chen and his story on ChinaAid.org. I'm happy now to hand it over to our host, Bob Fu. Bob?
Welcome back to the Bob Fu Report. Today we want to talk about the Communist Party's so-called zero COVID policy. The Communist Party of China had been very proud of its own COVID policy since it released the Wuhan virus to the world in the early spring of 2020, and actually many even had recorded the Wuhan virus had already erupted back to as early as September or October 2019. Whatever the timing, the Communist Party engaged this so-called zero COVID policy, basically laughing at the United States and the European countries for a great number of COVID infected and, of course, a record number of deaths because of this CCP virus from Wuhan. And what this zero COVID policy meant, basically, the Communist Party's so-called zero COVID is an elimination strategy utilizing the lockdowns, the quarantines, the mass testing, and of course the contact tracing under this Communist Party's dictatorial surveillance system of massive control. Of course, since COVID erupted, the Communist Party designed this health app is for so-called contact tracing. So each citizen, so every citizen of 1.4 to 1.5 billion people, they have to have a smartphone, have to be mandated to install this so-called health app directly connected with the police, with their the Chinese government, CDC, with the local government, with their neighborhood, basically for the so-called contact tracing. I mean, essentially, is everybody is closely under the Big Brother's watch and monitoring. So you can imagine from the time you are at home to when you walk out of your door to when you go shopping, when you are walking your dog, when you're calling your friends. So every moment and every movements that you engage had been under this so-called COVID health app control. It's supposed to be, health tracing for COVID purpose, and has quickly become a massive kind of a digital surveillance tool. So that's essentially the so-called zero COVID policy. And has the Communist Party produced zero COVID? And that's laughter, of course, because from the very beginning, when Wuhan was erupted with COVID, the Communist Party, under public and international pressure, finally acknowledged a few, 1,000 cases, and then maybe 10,000 or some cases or death. They only acknowledged really very small number. But does anyone really believe that is the number, especially comparing the massive cremation and the piles of cell phones outside the cremation sites in Wuhan? There should be tens of thousands, maybe 1,000 times of the number the Communist Party had acknowledged. And plus, the Communist Party, their data collecting of so-called COVID death is dramatically different. Those who died out of the COVID and with lung disease, with other heart problems, they would not constitute as COVID death, unlike what had been counted by the U.S. healthcare system. And I think that's another stretch. Maybe the truth is in the middle. So in Shanghai, just in the month of March 2022, this year, the whole world is watching. The Shanghai had been under severe lockdown, complete lockdown, dividing into just two zones. It's called Pudong, the East Pudong, the district zone, and Puxi, the West Pudong. The city of Pudong. So basically, initially it was in rotation, but in the end, it cannot sustain. This Shanghai, the city of 26 million people, with 200,000 cases have been reported since the outbreak in late March, had been under total lockdown. It forced the U.S. consulate in Shanghai initially to evacuate the non-essential, family members of the U.S. diplomats. And then just a few days after that order, the State Department hurriedly ordered all the U.S. embassy, the consulate diplomats and personnels evacuated from this zero COVID policy Shanghai. And the so-called no tolerance policy means only the healthcare workers, the some government designated volunteers, and some delivery personnel, and those with the special permission from the government can move with some freedom. And quarantined residents, you talk about 26 million people, they must order their food or wait for officials to drop off, through their their apps. So the groceries, if the officials would not deliver the food timely, people are starving right now. I mean, even some of the foreign workers, they have reported about this. So the food and the supplies had been really short, and they're quickly dwindling. Many are even ordered to relocate, and some neighborhood would be suddenly ordered to evacuate their homes in order to make that whole neighborhood as a temporary quarantine shelters. I mean, many videos on social media have been showing those little children were kneeling down on the street, crying out, and their parents were being taken by force, just simply because they want to argue with the officials that they're not tested positive at all, but because of this Communist Party brutal order, they were taken in by force. And one famous audio recording showing a couple in their apartment arguing with the policeman who received order from their Shanghai CDC to take them to the quarantine location because the CDC shows that they were tested positive in the massive kind of testing scheme. But it ended up the couple actually were negative. It was the messed up of the CDC on their database, with so many people were mistakenly as positive. And then the police were kind of ordered to enforce that order. And the government had a phone line to call, to correct for the record. Nobody answered the phone. So the police was arguing and threatening, said, we're going to enforce the law, no matter what, because we only got this one data from CDC. That's the authority. And if you don't leave, we have to handcuff you and take you to that massive, almost like a concentration camp. So the wife and husband were wailing, crying out, and said, we're tested negative. If you took us away to that quarantine center, we will quickly become positive. There is, no justice. The wife was basically said, where is the justice? It is the government mistake. And then, basically in the end, then the conversation, it seems the police threat was effective, and basically the wife in that apartment said she has to comply and go. So this is, shows, of course, the Communist Party's the brutality, and we have received credible reports from people on the ground, American missionaries. They receive live data showing people were jumping out of their floor, from their the tall building, and committed suicide. And of course, with the quarantine, this so-called zero tolerant policy, neighborhood would be sealed, like your doors would be locked from outside, sealed by the police and health officials. So some, even the residents who has pregnant women who are not allowed to even go for their baby delivery, and then some even police and COVID enforcing officials. I mean, already there's they were forced to kind of stay for too long, like too far stretch. I mean, they basically had a breakdown, and at least one, I saw that one COVID enforcement official also committed suicide by jumping out of the window of his office. And this is very inhumane. I think the death toll, the casualty for ordinary citizens is way more dangerous than the COVID itself. And at the meantime, this so-called zero COVID policy had impacted the persecution of Christians. The government has used this time and this technique as a window of opportunity to persecute Christians. For instance, in Taiyuan, a Zion Reformed Christian church, they were raided by the police, and 7 Christians were taken into custody for interrogation. So the Taiyuan is the capital city of Shanxi province in central China. So the official, they found 4 confirmed cases of Omicron. Only 4 cases in that like 10 million, at least over 10 million population. So they locked down the surrounding neighborhood, and so when the Zion Reformed Church, they finished their worship service, they received lockdown updates from their district called Xiaodian district, and they learned that across the street, there is one positive case of COVID. Then these Christians tried to leave the neighborhood. A police officer showed up and basically broke in and claiming that all Christians who are who were present in that worship location need to show their health code, a green code, and basically the health code, and then you have a travel code called journey code to prevent the spread of COVID in that district. And then the national security officers arrived. For COVID, it's supposed to be this health issue. And what has that to do with national security or state security officers? So they came. So these Christians initially thought they could just go home after their code, were shown as a green or checked, but the police prohibited them from leaving that hotel where they worship because of the COVID test. So in the end, 21 adults and 7 children, they were all tested negative already, but they were still forbidden to leave the facility. Later on, of course, they were all taken for interrogation for their really Christian faith. At the same time, under the Shanghai lockdown, the Shanghai Disneyland, they were also shut down for 2 days. That's back to November, just because one visitor was tested positive. So the officials end up testing another 100,000 people. 100,000 people. Who reportedly visited close by at the Disneyland in Shanghai during that time. Of course, the Chinese public had been really, really exhausted and tired and worn thin under this so-called zero COVID policy. It won't work. With this Omicron, then with the variant Omicron, the subvariant of Omicron is coming. The Communist Party must have on their little tubes, all kinds of variants they can just accidentally just releasing and to make the world feel it even worse. But in any case, this is the result of a totalitarian tyrannical regime, but basically try to use this health crisis for their own advantage to control the population. So finally, just last update about what's happening for the Mayflower Church who are still stuck at Jeju Island in South Korea. Unfortunately, more than half of those family members of the Mayflower Church had been tested and contracted with the COVID-19. But the good thing is that by the grace of the Lord, all of them had been recovered very quickly. Even those little children, some have very serious underlying diseases. They were all recovered and healed. One of the elders, Elder known Jian Feng, he actually wrote an article sent to China Aid as part of the update of Mayflower. You can read that from ChinaAid.org, the section on the Mayflower update. This is what Elder Nong said. He said, half of the families in our church tested positive during this surge of the pandemic, but we are very thankful that we all have helped each other go and get medicines. South Korea's COVID prevention method is to quarantine at home for 7 days, but everyone is free to come and go if they'd like. In fact, in the face of this pandemic, the most terrifying thing is not the virus, but the human heart. The most terrifying thing is not the virus itself, but the human heart. Imposing people's thoughts on others will cause people to suffer even more, especially under the policy of so-called zero COVID. It causes even more humanitarian disasters and restrictions on human rights. End of quote. So please continue to pray. Now with the lockdowns, not only in Shanghai, it is extended to, of course, partial part of the Hong Kong and Guangdong province, and of course the Jilin province, the province next to North Korea. They are still under this lockdown. And this lockdown has really caused so much more casualties than the COVID itself. So pray for the missionaries in Shanghai who are also under tremendous stress. And those foreigners relatively, because the Western government protesting, had a little bit more freedom with a better food supply to them. But many people, they show on their app, they order food, they could not get delivery. There is no food. And the corrupted officials, of course, they only take care of their own family members. And so this policy is just totally mismanaged and miscalculated. I hope President Xi Jinping and his team can have a wake-up call. But it seems so far, Xi Jinping just recently issued another slogan based on zero tolerance and zero COVID policy has to be continued. So I guess, the it's a zero care of human life policy. So we should pray that the Lord will have a breakdown of this evil system, and more people through this system can see the true color, nature of the Chinese Communist Party, and can wake up. And in just recent days, actually hundreds of thousands, some of the Shanghai people, residents, under the lockdown, they just went out of their homes, just in mass and for protesting. Of course, they were quickly cracked down by the overwhelming police force. Some were beaten up right in front of, on the street. So let's pray for China, pray for this time, pray for the Chinese church, pray for those who are suffering in the Chinese prison and concentration camps. Thank you for watching. May God bless you.